so much for being here. This is the Be Yoga Star. We're trying to create an awareness and bring out the light of yoga teachers out into the world and help those people who just finished their teacher training program or just in their first year or 2 years trying to really step out and really understand how to make a success with their yoga teaching. And Jordan over here, I remember meeting Jordan when he was practicing and then when he was choosing his first teacher training program, and it was just an inspiration because Jordan understood right from the very beginning that yoga teaching has a potential, but you have to actually step forward and do actions on the subject. And I realized as he was working and doing things that the way he approached it is different than how most yoga teachers were approaching it, and very similar to how I was and how we should be. And he and I have always had conversations on why and what's going on, and he just came back from India, and this was a great way for me to help support his teaching and then also kind of get an insight for everyone else about his experience and things of that nature. So I'm going to let Jordan kind of say a couple of words about himself so he can introduce himself.
Glad to be here, Gabe. Thanks for having me. So I started, as Gabe said, when I gave about almost close to 2 years ago, just when I was still practicing at a local studio in my town of Davis. And back in the summer of 2003, I did my first yoga teacher training, which Gabe was a part of, and got to come to share his insights and teaching for a portion of the training. And after doing my teacher training, I finished last August 2013, and I started teaching at the studio that I had done my training at, and a couple privates here and there. And then in the middle of November of last year, I decided to move on to becoming a full-time yoga teacher. And I started teaching anywhere ranging between 9 to 15 classes a week. And they varied from studios, personal homes, to gyms, Pilates studios. So I was just picking up and being able to, my goal was to help people incorporate yoga in many different aspects of life, and was trying to reach the mass public. So some of those who couldn't come into the yoga studios, I was still able to come and bring yoga to them.
Right.
And then in March this year, I went to India for the first time for an almost 2-month training program up in the north of India to enhance my teaching skills and also to gain insight to the Eastern style of the yoga practice, which is something that's interesting to me, being a philosophy student. Especially Eastern-based philosophy was a big part of what drove me into yoga originally. And after returning back from my journeys, I taught through the summer once again, but then went back abroad to India, this time back through the south, where I did an Ashtanga-based training, and then traveled through Southeast Asia. And while traveling, was fortunate enough to teach along the way at different places. So, and now I'm back in the States, and getting ready to move down to the Bay Area. I'm excited to continue teaching and continuing help getting students interested in coming and seeing the benefits of a yoga practice.
No, that's awesome. You know, it was inspiring to me that you went over to India the second time and went to the south after considering that I also lived in India and spent the time practicing Ashtanga, and having seen your interest in the subject and then actually going and spending the time and really diving into it, and then seeing the picture of what goes on in Mysore in southern India, especially also in comparison to what you saw in northern India when you did your 300 hours. We want to maybe share a couple of things that you saw the difference between southern India and northern India, whether from a Western teachers that go there or from an India perspective. Why don't you take a couple of moments and share with them what life in India was like? Because I know, but you just came from there, so it's great for you to share.
Yeah, well, India definitely has a different perspective when it comes to yoga, and it may be hard for some Westerners to first comprehend yoga as an idea out there. Yoga has a long-standing history, and unlike yoga here in the States, which has had this monumental boom in the last maybe 2 decades, yoga has been a foundation of life in India for thousands of years. Right. And it's looked at from a very different perspective. It's not, the physical practice is a very small portion of it. Now, when I was in the north for the first time, I was originally in Rishikesh, which they call the Mecca. Some say the birthplace of yoga. And yoga out there is taken from a very, not only deep spiritual practice, but a very personal practice. A lot of the teachers that you encounter out there have been dedicated themselves to the yoga practice since a very young age, since childhood. And most of them have grown up teaching or studying yoga. And the yoga we think in the West is the physical practice. We think of asana, and we think that this is what yoga is all about, going into a studio, coming onto our mat. And for them, that is the very minuscule part of it, maybe 2% of the big picture. And yoga for them is something that can be able to make personal however each individual sees it. And what was interesting there, and what's challenging for a lot of Westerners, like myself, when I first went, I thought, oh, I'm going for yoga. I'm going to do lots of practice. It's going to be great. But the big part of it is actually moving into meditation, moving into searching within oneself, and also having a bigger understanding of the yoga picture, looking at it's just gone throughout the years. And so it was quite an eye-opening experience because it broadened my idea of what yoga was.
Wow.
I had always had a basic understanding of the philosophy, the background of yoga, but I didn't really fully dive into it until I was able to go to the north and experience this different side of it. And finding that connection was a big inspiration and a big part for me. And which also inspired me to go back later and go down to the south of India, where I went and studied Ashtanga. And the south and the north are very different. When I experienced in Mysore with the Ashtanga perspective, was even more personal, and was something that what got me into the Ashtanga practice was the idea that it's a personal practice, and that the personal responsibility falls on yourself. And although in a Mysore style class, you may be in a room of 40, 50 people, you're doing the sequence at your own pace, keeping this own connection with your breath. And what I found great about the Ashtanga practice, being a yoga teacher, once you start teaching yoga, it's difficult for you to go and actually take yoga classes. Because being a teacher, your mind is constantly going, and it's hard for you to actually focus into your own physical practice. And what drove me to the Ashtanga practice was the idea that I could do this myself once I learned the sequence, and I could do it anywhere throughout the world, anytime. All I needed was my own mat. And being able to go and learn that personal responsibility, the idea that you can have this practice by yourself, and being able to do it anywhere was something that intrigued me very much, and brought me into Mysore to study Ashtanga.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, I remember the days when we were talking about the practice of Ashtanga and how it's just so practical for me, because you get to come in and say, hey, you get to come in and really just dive into a morning practice and kind of get your breath connected, your whole day set, and you don't have to think about it, and you really learn the value of what real meditation is when you dive right into the Ashtanga practice. How much of those times when we were playing and things of that nature helped kind of push and then kind of change a certain perspective on your teaching, if at all?
From the Ashtanga practice, the idea, I wanted to touch on the fact about you said about the meditation part of it. Something that's very hard for, I think, a lot of us here in the West is the actual act of coming and sitting down and having a meditative style practice. And what's great about the Ashtanga practice is that, as you said, you're finding that connection with your breath, and you're moving through an actual meditation. And I think it's something that that a lot of students can really benefit from having that practice, because it allows them, for people like myself included, who find it very challenging to make time constantly be able to sit and meditate. Having this Ashtanga practice can allow that meditation to take effect. And then it also can help you, allow you to practice to moving into actual seated meditation.
Right, right. Now you started with a hot yoga, and a lot of people, I think of Ashtanga and the hot yoga is the same kind of practices in their core, where here's the very similar style practice, and you develop a sense of concentration because things are not changing too much. The main difference between maybe the Ashtanga practice and the hot yoga practice is the fact that the Ashtanga practice has no words, and the hot yoga practice is structured through vocabulary of the teacher. How did you find that interaction, since you started with a hot yoga practice and just recently kind of discovered that dive into Ashtanga?
Well, yeah. Well, when I first started in yoga, almost the actual physical practice of the asana, I started with Bikram almost 7 years ago. And what drove me into Bikram originally was I came out of a car accident and I fractured my back. And at that time as well, I was also massively overweight. And yoga 7 years ago was quite different than how it is today. Now there's yoga studios in every corner, and everyone from movie stars to football players are doing it. But at the time when I first started, it wasn't a big thing that a lot of males were going to. And so I was driven to this idea that if I was going to do yoga, I was going to do it in the heat. So my idea of what yoga was supposed to be when I first entered into it was definitely a misconceived notion. But I found the benefits of going to the hot yoga practice fairly quickly. It took a couple times. It wasn't love at first sight. First walking into that room, especially in the shape that I was in, and the ability to not even bend down and bring my fingers past my knees. But what was great about the hot yoga practice was, especially for men, is it allows us to open up. And a lot of us are tighter, might have more muscle, maybe bigger, and the heat allows us to open up. And the ability to have a set sequence so you can see the progress as you move along is something great. And then having the dialogue that's taught by the teachers in any Bikram studio you go to, whether it's California or Tokyo, if it's the Bikram style, if it's a Bikram studio, they're going to have the same dialogue. And what's great for new students is the fact that having that same dialogue and having the same poses can allow you to find your rhythm in that practice. And when I went over to Ashtanga and started practicing that, they are quite similar. But something that I found a little bit more freeing in the Ashtanga practice was the idea that I didn't have to go and find a hot room to practice in, that I could have the practice wherever I was, and especially because this last year I spent 6 months abroad traveling, in foreign countries. There was most of the time not a hot yoga studio around, and all I had was a mat. But being able to have the Ashtanga practice allowed me to practice wherever I was at any time once I had learned that set sequence. And something that's great for new students when they're first coming into a yoga practice is being able to have a set sequence and having a style that's familiar to them that they can understand. And the merging between the idea of Ashtanga style yoga and heat-based yoga like Bikram, the two of them I think are very ingenious sequences, and bringing that style of flow with heat even increases and makes the class even that much better.
No, yeah, it's great because now we talked about the value for practitioners. How set practice leads for meditation, the value of Ashtanga. I've been doing Ashtanga for 15 years, so being able to hear from another point of view is inspiring for others, because it is, as a practitioner, when you learn the whole sequence, you can do it on your own, you can do it anywhere. But let's look a little bit now from teaching, So you just finished the teacher training program. I remember when we first did the teacher training, we looked at that idea that, wait, if you had a script like the Bikram, then you would have a lot more opportunities and you would feel more confident in going and teaching. And if you understood how to teach with words like the Bikram, you would probably become a better Ashtanga teacher, because the unfortunate, a lot of times for the Ashtanga practitioners, no words, so they get stuck with how to describe quickly and easily communication. And then the issue for Bikram people is that they get stuck with just a sense as if I can only speak these words, as opposed to learning something different, that you learned how to communicate. And that's why you and I, remember, we talked about communication differences.
No, right. I think the biggest challenge for yoga teachers, and something that I experienced when I dove into the full-time teaching, was definitely being able to have a dialogue and convey my teaching and what I wanted my students to do, how I wanted them to move into it, into their body. And it's challenging because I had a solid 5+ years of practice, and I knew how to do it in my body, and I knew what I needed to do. But it was difficult to be able, once you're in front of this room and you have all these students and they're looking at you and they're like, what do I do? What's difficult is to be able to guide them into it. Everyone can know the name of the pose and can tell you, say a basic thing to get you into it. But what you're really trying to do as a teacher is guide them and give them an experience so that they can move in. And then once they're properly aligned and in that pose, allowing them the freedom to then explore it deeper. But the most important part is, as a teacher, is being able to move them into that pose, get them to that place, and so that they're properly aligned and they know where they know how to get into it. I think is the biggest thing, and it is challenging when you're first starting, especially if you don't have the script. And as you had said with Bikram, it's easy for Bikram teachers to go off and be able to teach right away, but it's harder for them to branch out. And I've seen it from people who originally started with Bikram and learn from the Bikram training. They have the script and they're very solid on it and they know it word for word, but it doesn't allow the freedom to move outside of it. So being able to have a flow style class and to have a script that allows the teacher to guide the students through the flow style, it allows them to be able to teach right away. So it allows them to come out of a teacher training and be able to start teaching. But then it also allows them, if they want to explore other styles or move into different things, they already have a script and they already know how to guide through a majority of poses. So that as they learn and as they grow in their yoga teaching, they can branch out into different ways, different paths or different styles of teaching. But I think having a script at the beginning of class, but not having a set script in the sense that this is the only way you can teach, but having a set script that shows you how to teach a full class, but then gives you the freedom that you can take different poses and different ways of teaching that pose and maybe incorporating it further down the road once your yoga teacher skills have enhanced.
No, totally. I did a webinar the other day, and I was communicating that it's hard to share with words value as you communicate the pose, and insight, why am I doing the pose, and then, as you mentioned, the correct just ease and maybe humor as you're in that posture. So learning how to weave value, humor, and insight while keeping the student on track is challenging, and having a script really sets your mind on how to convey all that information. And if you have someone else giving you, then you do it a few times, you're confident, then you understand those principles, and then you begin to find your voice. But if you had that to begin with, it becomes a valuable tool. And while Bikram only has for the Bikram, here we looked at, hey, here's a half flow sequence, and here's a half flow dialogue or script for the class that we share, the Bikyasa class. Or here's a script for a flow class. Or here's a script for a yin class. Or here's a script for a Ashtanga class that doesn't have to follow the primary series. And if you have those scripts in your pocket, wouldn't you say that will become a successful avenue for a yoga teacher?
Oh, 100%. Guaranteed. And I think what's great about with the system of Bikyasa, as you said, it gives a wide variety. So you're giving teachers the ability to learn different styles and being able to have those in their pocket. Because the hardest thing when you first start teaching is, you get up in front of a room and you may have an idea going of how you want to have a class, and you might be teaching, and then all of a sudden you kind of draw a blank. And when you're staring in front of a room and there's 40 people looking at you, you don't really have the luxury of drawing a blank. But if you have that kind of script in the background and you have that you can fall back on and be able to teach, it's going to help. It's going to help you as a new yoga teacher to excel. But it also gives having the script from a Vigyasa point of view and having that kind of freedom that you have different styles. You have a Hatha, you have an Ashtanga, you have a Vinyasa, you have a Yin. So you can kind of incorporate different styles and you can go off and be able to teach different styles. Unlike if you just did a Bikram training and you leave with only a Bikram style script. Because the biggest thing also, as I had said, when I first started teaching and when you become a full-time yoga teacher, I think a lot of people may have the idea that yoga teaching and full-time yoga teaching is just at yoga studios. But
Right.
that's definitely far from the truth. And when you make that dive into a full-time yoga studio, it's not always luxury. And you have to be able to, if this is your job, you have to be able to find work. And a lot of teachers don't realize that there's so many places you can go, from gyms to schools to different recreation areas, community centers. There's so many places, and especially nowadays, that are offering yoga everywhere. And a lot of people think that they have to just go to a yoga studio, when in reality is that there's yoga all over the place,
Right.
and you can go and you can find it and be able to teach. And being able to recognize that you need to be able to change your style to gear towards the crowd that you're at. I mean, I've taught everyone from chair yoga to children, to athletes, and each time you teach to a different style of class, or if I teach at my regular studio, and I could have anyone from someone who just walked into yoga to someone who's been doing yoga for 20 plus years, you need to be able to have the ability to cater to each and every one. And the idea is that you can't cater to everyone, but being able to give at least something that everyone can, from all walks of life, can be able to benefit from yoga and not make it too challenging or too easy for everyone. And having the script and having that different styles and understanding different styles from Yin to Hatha to Ashtanga to Vinyasa and learning how to incorporate those at appropriate times is something I think that yoga teachers can definitely benefit from when they're first starting out.
No, yeah, you said it right on the bat, which is what I experienced the same as you. I started teaching 20 years ago and had to develop all these on my own. And correct, today is surprising. People think I can only teach in one environment. Again, in the webinar we looked at exactly what you just mentioned, all those other opportunities where you can go teach yoga at. Just to help people realize that there's a lot more that you're going to experience if you really want to go teach. And there's a lot more opportunities for you to go offer your services. And you just have to have the ability to be diversified, meaning being able to feel confident in that you know that this flow class or that Ashtanga experience or that hot flow or that yin, I know that it's a powerful class. Why? Because look, someone has taught that and it really works, and someone communicated that to a group of strangers. And that's what a script is how did you communicate to feel comfortable. And once I have that in mind, I can now kind of speak with my own voice, even though I realize that, wow, wait, that really is a good voice. And in our training, rather than thinking about a script, granted, we're talking here about a script, but in the last webinar we also looked at why certain words work compared to others. And if you can understand the why and then see examples of how that why works, then you know how to make it your own. But most of us never even learned the why or a how. I think you experienced that down in Mysore when you saw a bunch of people who graduated teacher trainings, and as you talked with them, you realized that they felt really confused. Those who don't come from Bikram, come from other trainings, they don't even have a script or anything. What was your experience?
Well, I think you're right. I think that something that a lot of teachers don't have right off the bat is the understanding. And there is a science to an actual teaching of an asana class. That's why set sequences like Bikram, like Ashtanga, they're so great. It's not that someone just came up with some ideas and threw them together. There's a science between how these poses are interacting with one another and moving in a set sequence. And it's important. One thing that I've seen a lot from newer teachers is they learn how to teach yoga, but they don't learn how to put things into a sequence. So you might start off at the beginning of class, taking some new teacher's class, and they may open up with a back bend or with twists or something that doesn't make sense within with an actual anatomy or a sequencing standpoint, and it's something that can actually hinder their teaching skills and also can potentially injure their students if they don't know how to move properly into it. So having a script and having the ability to understand, this is why we're doing this pose. We're coming out of a back bend, and now we're going to do a forward fold to be able to find a release from that back bend, and this is why. Or being able to understand how we're moving from a pose to this pose, and breaking down that anatomy perspective is something that students and teachers alike are going to benefit from. And it's going to help teachers be able to incorporate out this script when they're first graduating out of like a Vinyasa style class. They have a script and they know that these poses fit together. But it also allows them the freedom to understand that, that this pose goes with this pose. So maybe if they end up going and they teach a Vinyasa style class, if they go somewhere else, they can realize, oh, well, I can do this pose followed by this one, and this is why I'm doing it. Instead of just throwing out different poses, there is a science behind it that I think a lot of yoga teachers don't understand. And there's also, I think, as yoga becomes popular, people feel the pressure to make up new things or try weird poses that aren't really yoga poses and are just something that they think is something that looks cool, and they're trying to seem fresh. When actuality is that students are going to benefit and love your yoga classes more if you're teaching straightforward poses and a very organized and set sequence.
Wow, that was beautifully said, man. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head in relation to what we see today by people trying to diversify themselves because they feel that they don't communicate or having a hard time communicating, and only because they just weren't provided with those particular tools. Well, lastly, as we wrap up, this was really an awesome conversation. I really value your time. You shared a lot of amazing information about just your experience in India and how that developed your own personal growth, how you got inspired by seeing the practice of Ashtanga. We practiced together. I remember feeling like I pushed you a little bit to go down over there to Mysore and find the outside aspects so you can dive into the practice, and you did. And it's really inspiring what it did for you. And then also just, again, how you recognize that to come out and to teach well, I had to step out and find out. And even during teacher training, you discovered that there's a lot of different places I could teach yoga at. And you went, you created your own private types of classes. So any kind of thoughts you may want to share with someone who's coming out trying to teach that you might give them as an insight?
Definitely. I think one of the most important things is that, and something that happens when a lot of times people become yoga teachers, is they forget their own personal practice. And it gets put to the side because you're trying to scramble and you're trying to teach it. But the most important thing in being able to be a successful yoga teacher is to have that practice. Because if you're not keeping up with your practice, you're not going to be able to convey or teach that to your other students. And something that I see a lot of times is something that first happened for me when I made that dive into teaching full time. And I was teaching, maybe an 8 p.m. class one night, getting off at 9, having to teach 6 a.m. the next day is important to be able to make sure that you have time to keep up with your own practice. And it's also important to, when you first start teaching, to expand your horizons. Because as I say, go to not just yoga studios, but to look at, gyms, recreational centers, private lessons. I mean, the most important thing that someone can do to teach is keep teaching. I
Right.
mean, it's like the saying, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And it's very true. If you don't keep teaching, or if you don't keep practicing, and you think, okay, I've done my teacher training, I want to take a break now, and maybe 6 months from now, I'll go back to yoga, all that stuff you have, it's going to go away. And
Right.
something that reminds me of an analogy I've used before is it's kind of like math. Like in math, there's a formula to it. There's a science, there's an idea, and there's a set way to do it right. And when you're learning mathematics, you have to keep it up. Otherwise, if you go, you stop using it, you're going to look at it and you're like, what does this formula mean? I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Right.
And it's the same way with yoga. Is when it comes to teaching from an asana perspective, is that there is a science and there is a proper way to do it, and you need to be able to keep practicing it in your own body, and you have to keep teaching it. There's definitely an overcoming of when you first start teaching and going in front of a room. For some people who've maybe never done it before, and maybe you're going in front of a room of one person, or maybe you're going in a room in front of 50 people, and the idea is that you have to be able to be on point to be able to teach and reach your students. Something that I've said before is that yoga teaching has, when it comes from a teacher, has nothing to do about you, but also has everything to do about you. It's kind of a conundrum.
Right.
Because if you're going in front of a class, it's not your practice, it's their practice. But at the same time, if you're off and you don't know what you're doing, then you're ruining their practice.
Right.
So you need to be on point, and you need to be able to stand up there and know what you're doing to be able to teach the proper class. And being able to, one thing that I've seen from being a teacher is that, if you can go and you can convey and you can teach from a place of understanding, you don't need to do all these weird incorporations and adding all these strange poses and things that no one's ever seen before to try to keep it original. Students are going to keep coming to your class if they're going to see the benefits the next day. If they're going to leave their class and they're like, wow, like I feel great the next morning, open up, like I feel like this class was amazing. You don't need to change it up. All you need to do is make sure that when your students leave, they leave feeling great, and the next day they leave. The next day they wake up feeling great, and that's going to keep bringing them back. Not coming up with strange poses and inventing new Sanskrit words. That's not going to keep the students in your class. So.
That's awesome. No, I love hearing you say that because I like saying that, and I've been practicing for 20 years now, and I'm always shocked. The yoga has enough benefits, so why do we need to mess it up? And why not just allow the student to have a yoga experience, which is simple? At the end of the day, we're teaching someone how to get into their body, but it's, as you said, it's complicated. I have to stand in front of a crowd. I have to face my own fears of communicating. And then the element about a sequence. What did you learn? What did you take? How much of the physical understanding of a yoga practice are you incorporating? But that's just the magic, in my opinion, of a scripted class, of set sequences that are producing the maximum results. That's why when I take an Ashtanga and I practice in the morning, it's like, wow, I know what it feels to be great. I don't have to practice the fourth Siri to feel good. You can just do sun salutation A and B and feel incredible and walk with your day feeling awesome. So you don't have to complex things. And really the simplicity and how to create simplicity is what I then found in the Bikram dialogue, the magic of that simplicity, and then weaving simplicity with any other communicating of any other yoga pose was what I felt was lacking. And here we are trying to share that it's not complex, it is easy. Here's the simple tricks that you can go on your own, speak with action-based vocabulary, keep it simple, concentrate on being present and aware of the room. Or you could then find how scripts work, and then you can apply those to your specific needs.
No, exactly, and it goes back to the idea I was talking about math. I'm not a math fan. I'm not a math man myself personally, but yoga doesn't need to be calculus. It
Right.
can be addition. You can keep it simple. It doesn't have to be. It just needs to be If you know the formula for it, you don't need to get advanced with it.
Exactly.
As you said, you can wake up and do the most basic thing. Same thing I do when I wake up, sun salutations. You don't need to add on different stuff to it. It's great to explore and be able to incorporate newer things, but just remembering and having a basic system is all you really need.
Exactly. And that's what we try to do here in Be Yoga Stars, help you define how to be simple, effective, and change lives day by day by just keeping things real and keeping things accessible to any person you're going to come in contact with, whether they're a ballerina or an 80-year-old individual. I just saw an 80-year-old man who was practicing our Haflo Bikyasa style, and here 6 months ago he was 30 pounds heavier. In 6 months of practicing 3 or 4 times, similar sequence, just kind of having teachers are able to understand how to provide that experience with good vocabulary so that he as an 80-year-old man can still move and feel comfortable with himself. His cholesterol numbers are better, his diabetes numbers are down, his weight is down. So you don't have to complex things. When you make it simple, it's accessible. And our job as yoga teachers is really to go serve that out into the world. And you can do that in so many places now, and so many people. You need your time, need your services, and need what you have to have. And Jordan and I attest to that by stepping out into that world and actually doing it. Wouldn't you say that, Jordan?
Most definitely.
So, wow, I really want to thank you for your time, buddy. And hopefully we can do this again. Now that we've done it, we can do this again and see what kind of comments and reactions we have from our viewers. And hopefully this served everyone. Any last thoughts or comments you want to share with them?
No, I would definitely love to do this again. I think it's definitely beneficial to have something I wish I had when I first started teaching full time, to have that community and have a place for open questions and to be able to receive dialogue back from people who are already in the profession and already doing it daily. One last point I wanted to touch on when you brought up about the idea. You were talking about this 80-year-old man and coming as a yoga teacher is to remember when you first started yoga and not to lose sight of how it first felt when you came.
Right.
To recognize that the first few times it felt awkward, or how remembering how challenging it first was. Because one thing that ends up happening for yoga teachers is you say, do headstand like this. And someone doesn't have any idea like how you're supposed to do that. And for you, it's so simple. You can just go right into it. But something that I always try to do is to remember the first time I walked into a Bikram studio. And to remember the fact that, I was overweight and no idea what was going on. And I couldn't even bring my fingers to that perspective. My first couple of years was for my yoga practice. So when I get in front of the room, I'm able to convey and make yoga accessible to each and every person who's in that room. And remembering it, it's something that ends up getting hard when you have a practice and you have a solid practice and you practice for years. Of course, your practice is going to become more advanced. But the most important part of being a teacher is to be able to touch and reach that person who first walks into a yoga studio. Like, as I said, I teach at studios where sometimes the room is filled with anyone from someone from their first class.
Wow, hold on. Hey, babe, will you bring me the cord?
To do. And I think a lot of times when we first start teaching is we think of we're trying to teach to our level, of how our practice is, or to practitioners who have an advanced practice.
Oh, it's there.
But recognizing that the most important thing is being able to reach those students who are brand new.
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm just plugging in so my computer doesn't die over here. I remember the very first training that, hey, teach for the beginner. And what I loved about Bikram and what I like about Hot and the way I think about scripts is that, look, here's how you teach for a beginner. Because the advanced, they already know. Your job as a teacher is to help that person who's first time to get into their body and most effectively and enjoy the practice. If I'm already practicing, then I'm sold. If I'm not, then I want to be able to feel okay about myself. And I want to realize that it is possible to come towards. I think for guys like you and I, where we had the challenges of to be where we are in our practice today, maybe we have a little bit more affinity to feel for the beginner compared to sometimes you have yoga practitioners that maybe came from gymnastics, so they're already very proficient and they're successful just because they're great acrobatics, but they don't have that relation to that brand new person on how to be in their body.
No, very, very true. Yeah, and I think as it goes back, as being back, it's important to always, as a yoga teacher, to always think of that first time that you walked in, and always, if you can keep that idea and you can remember that, your teaching is going to be much better than if you're thinking of yourself as a teacher and how you are now.
Oh, exactly. Meaning, the minute you realize that it's not about you, it's about the student, then your teaching becomes completely transformed. And that's when you realize that, wow, a star guides us. That's the idea. A star guides us. Your job is to guide a person to find their light. And that's about them and not about us. So Jordan, I hope you have an awesome day. And really thank you so much. And hopefully everyone got a lot of value from that. We'll definitely do this again.
Thanks for having me, Gabe. Always a pleasure.